Welcome everyone to the fourth session of the day, which is a special panel on Afghanistan. And for those of you who are joining us now, welcome to the conference as well on Reimagining Citizenship in South Asia. My name is Dr. Filippo Bonni, and I'm a lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open University in the UK. I have the pleasure of convening the Politics of South Asia Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference. I'm really pleased to have you all here and that we are able to feature a panel on Afghanistan, which is dedicated exclusively to Afghanistan in today's conference. What we've seen, the recent events in Afghanistan have really been one of the most consequential and really tragic developments in today's world politics. And this is too often, I feel, a country and a conflict in general that is interpreted through the prism of great power rivalry, while somehow neglecting, overlooking what the implications of the Taliban takeover will be for ethnic and religious minorities, as well as for Afghan women and ordinary citizens. So we are delighted and extremely fortunate to have a stellar lineup of panelists with us today that will certainly help us make sense of some of the most recent dynamics regarding Afghanistan, and that will guide us with their insights to understand some of the challenges in greater detail. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Indrajit Roy, who, again, for those of you who are joining us today, is the principal investigator of the project Reimagining Citizenship, funded by the AHRC and based at the University of York. So, Indrajit, over to you.
Thank you, Filippo. You saved me the the standard introduction I've been doing to myself at every session. So very grateful to you. But I have to say, I wish the circumstances were more happy that we sort of, got to learn from our colleagues in Afghanistan. One of the reasons we were absolutely clear we wanted to have a special panel was, of course, in addition to the events in that country, is that I think generally the world forgets that Afghanistan is, after all, central to the way South Asia as a region is, understood, and it is a part of South Asia, in addition to it being sort of, being at the crossroads of Asia, as it were. We have so much to learn from what's going on in Afghanistan. Not only from the point of view of our research consortium, where we study the implications of the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act in India, but also in the light of the contestations of citizenship in South Asia as a region. To help us understand the citizenship conundrum in Afghanistan, beyond what we hear, as Filippo said, from military strategists, geopolitical analysts, and economists concerned about the future of rare earths in Afghanistan, we want to know what's going on in the country, what's going on with the people in the country, and we are therefore very grateful to our panelists for willing to sharing their expertise with us this evening on this special panel on Afghanistan that is being convened by the Department of Politics at York and the Political Studies Association South Asia Specialist Group. We have four panelists joining us today. We have Samira Hamidi from Amnesty International. We have Omar Sadr from American University of Afghanistan. We have Qazi Marzia Babakarkhail, former Supreme Court judge in Afghanistan, and Jennifer Fluri from the University of Colorado. Very warm welcome to all of you, and very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I would request speakers to make your interventions in about 8 to 10 minutes. The format is to have all four presentations one after the other. Following that, we will have some comments from Dr. Rudab Shaheed from New College, Florida, who has joined us today as discussant. And after that, we will have a general round of discussions from among the panelists and everyone who's present here. So without further ado, may I invite Samira Hamidi, campaigner at Amnesty, to share her perspectives on human rights of religious minorities in Afghanistan. Ma'am, you have 10 minutes. When you have 2 minutes left, I'll be waving this sign. At 10 minutes, that is when your time's up, I will wave this sign. I hope that's okay, and apologies in advance. Over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, to this discussion, and for, in fact, arranging a special event on Afghanistan. I think it's very timely and very much needed. I strongly believe that we really need to speak about the situation. Of course, what we hear from the media is always there, but it's always good to hear from Afghans and from the ground on what's going on. I have been given a very difficult task, actually, of speaking about a very important topic, which is the religious minorities. I am not 100% expert in the field, but I have been advocating always for them, and I'll be specifically, as I was told, I'll be specifically focusing on Hindu and Sikh religious minority in Afghanistan, who are, I have some of great friends from them, and of course they're part of us. When you look at the Afghanistan, overall situation and overall where the division of ethnicity and groups are. Of course, the Hindu and Sikh religious minority represents only 1% of the population. Despite of the fact that years back, around during 70s, this group was a major group, like 700,000 of them were in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, because of 4 decades of conflict and violence in Afghanistan, their number obviously reduced, and we are, even today, we are witnessing that. Unfortunately, the rights of religious minority Hindu and Sikh has not been respected and has not been considered vital and important to have different governments in Afghanistan. There hasn't been specific laws and legislations to address their needs and to support them. One side of the discrimination that Hindu and Sikh minority group has faced in Afghanistan is, of course, the war and conflict and presence of militant groups, different militant groups in different timings. But they have also faced discriminations in terms of access to education, in terms of gaining the respect as Afghan citizens in the country, and practicing their religion and contributing in the country's economies, social and political spheres, despite of the fact that we have had some of the fantastic membership in the parliament and Senate. You might have heard about Dr. Anarkali Hunaria. She was a senator previously to become a senator. She was a member of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and a very strong voice for Afghanistan, I would say, a very, very strong voice for women of Afghan, for Afghan women. Similarly, there were other members of the parliament. There were members of the art that were from our brothers and sisters from the religious minority Hindu and Sikh. There was, of course, a difficult time, a very violent time, actually, for Hindu and Sikh minority group during civil war between 92 to 96, where of course their rights were violated. They were harassed, their belongings were taken away from them, and even they were brutally murdered and kidnapped and disappeared. this continued when Taliban took over, because Taliban, of course, being a very, a very strict religious conservative group, they made very specific to Hindu and Sikh community to wear yellow bands so that they are, identified in the society, in the community they're getting out. Last 20 years, again, has been bloody for them. Last 20 years did not really serve them well in Afghanistan. Some of the bloodiest attacks that happened in Nangarhar, in Kabul, which resulted in killing of dozens of Hindu and Sikh minority groups, actually made them flee the country further, reduce their numbers. And there were literally reports of around 220 or 200 families in Afghanistan. Sometimes last year when the Gurdwara attack happened last year. And today, obviously, I'm sure some of them have managed to evacuate, leave the country, flee the country. The recent example that we saw when Taliban took over on 15 August was that a van or a bus of our brothers and sisters who were hoping to get to the airport was actually stopped and was taken to a different part of the city for several hours, and there was a lot of concern about their whereabouts, about their safety, because nobody was saying anything. It was obviously done by the Taliban. They went on record and they spoke about it. We, of course, because of security and safety reasons, and none of them who were released later spoke about what did they do with them, why they were taken away. But that fear itself, that kind of violence that they showed to them just to take them away, and they were all in one bus, which was so dangerous for them, is a clear example that they will not be safe, that they will not be supported, protected in Afghanistan, that their rights will not be supported by a very conservative and fundamentalist group that are right now, unfortunately, having the authority in Afghanistan. There are a couple of things that needs to happen in these circumstances for those of them who are still in Afghanistan. First of all, we have been pushing strongly for a robust mechanism for investigation and reporting of a human rights situation of people, including and especially specifically for the religious minorities like Hindu and Sikh communities, and that's where we have been strongly talking to Human Rights Council, and we think it's something that needs to be done. Countries in the world who are still supporting Afghanistan, they have to make sure that there's a guarantee for the safe passage and for the exit of those who remain in the country. Because again, as I started, I don't really see any means of protection for them. There's no guarantee. And finally, whatever humanitarian support and planning will take place in the coming future, especially by the UN and international community, they need to make sure that religious minorities, especially the Hindu and Sikh community, who will remain in the country or who will not be able to leave the country, are given to them and are provided to them. I believe that the Hindu and Sikh representatives in Afghanistan who are part of us have contributed a lot. We have a lot of respect for them, and that's where their rights matter equally as anyone else in Afghanistan. And I really hope there will be ways for us to continue monitor their situation and provide support to them. I'll stop here. If there will be any question, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm sure there will be questions that will emerge from our colleagues, so we'll keep them for that. But thank you also for sticking to time. That's much appreciated. Now, may I invite Omar Sadr from the American University of Afghanistan to share with us his expertise on the ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. You have a book, Omar, on the subject, which I'm sorry I've not yet read, but I really look forward to reading at some point soon. So, sir, you have 10 minutes. Again, when you have 2 minutes left, I will put up this sign. And at 10 minutes, I will wave this sign. So apologies in advance, but it's all yours now.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. I hope you can hear me. So good evening from Delhi, and my gratitude to organizers, particularly Dr. Roy, for inviting me in this session. Though I was, I think, one of the last speakers who came to know about this. So that's why I tried to put up certain thoughts on the issue of politics of citizenship. My book is on cultural diversity in Afghanistan and how diversity has been negotiated. So I have discussed the relationship between society, identity, and the state through the lens of liberalism and also multiculturalism and some critiques of those theories. Now, here I will speak something different, not from that book, but some of the thoughts that I drafted yesterday on politics of citizenship in Afghanistan. Now, the first thing is, I think the modern state of Afghanistan was constructed between 1880 to 1920s. As a post-colonial state, the modern state in Afghanistan adopted modalities of state functionaries from the European state as well as from its neighboring states in Asia, including Turkey, British India back then, and Persia. For instance, the first law concerning citizenship, national ID cards and passports were adopted in the reign of Amanullah in October 1923. A uniform law aimed to regulate all three issues, including citizenship, ID, national ID, and passports, together in a single code. Now, this law, like any other law in the Amanullah reign, was copied somehow or adopted from the Ottoman legal system. The level of influence of Ottoman system, for instance, could be understood from the terminologies, at least from the terminologies used in the law. For example, the term Taskiri Nufuz in Farsi in Afghanistan is similar to that of Ottoman Turkish formal terminology of Nufuz Taskrasi. Now, as John Turpey argues that passport and identification cards are the ways or tools that the state embrace the people and society, the first law on citizenship, identification card and passport in Afghanistan also had the same goal. But in the last 100 years, the politics of recognition of sociocultural identity and also politics of citizenship have differed from one government to the other. National identification documents provided the state the capacity to segregate population under different categories, such as tribe or ethnicity or religious sect. While certain governments provided recognition for tribal or ethnic identities, others avoided the same policy in national identity cards, for example. For example, while women were deprived of having citizenship or national ID cards at the early stages, they got their right much later, after 1950s. And similarly, recognition, for example, in terms of language, Punjabi language was denied as a mother language of Hindu people or Sikh people in Afghanistan. Or some other aspect, if you realize the registration of Uzbek and Turkmen ethnic groups in the state of Turks, for example, as an overall identity that they identify themselves. Or registration of Pashtuns as a supra-ethnic identity in the state of Durrani, Ghalzai, Safi, or other tribal identities that were much more relevant back then in early 20th century. Or for instance, recognition of Arabs, Sadat or Farsiwan in the state of Tajik and the national ID cards of Afghanistan has played substantial role in framing and eliminating identities. As a result, these policies and measures, certain categories such as tribe or ethnicity or nationality were invented by the state. Hence, it is important to analyze the shift in the state policies and ideology, administrative practices, and enactment of laws and regulations with regard to citizenship and identity recognition or recording. From a normative perspective, we have to study laws concerning citizenship, national identity, for example, Taskira in Afghanistan, under different governments through a comparative method to understand how a state has modified the national or sub-national identity. Now, in terms of literature, there are enormous amount of, or profuse amount of scholarship on citizenship and politics of identity or recognition in Afghanistan, but at the same time, there are certain loopholes also. For example, I can raise 3 issues now here. So now, when it comes to Afghanistan, literature there has been plenty of literature discussing either socio-economic issues or political issues. The research has hardly, however, touched upon politics of citizenship and the shifting notion of local or national identity through state mediation and invention of identity cards or passports in Afghanistan. I'm saying this based on, for example, what a scholar Torpy argues that documentary controls of this sort, for example, ID or passport, reflects an essential but largely understudied aspect of modern states. Now, this issue is somehow quite matching when it comes to Afghanistan. Second, identification cards such as passport or national ID have been seen and analyzed as a means of state control over movement and mobility of citizens. For example, in his book, Invention of Passport, the scholar that I named earlier has argued how modern identity cards and passport system played a crucial role in establishment of a state as an institution. However, it has not been studied how a state used identification cards and passports to mediate, construct, and transform ethnic, religious, or national identities of its people. Third and last one.
Sorry, just to say you have 2 minutes left, if that's okay.
Sure. I will finish this quickly. So third, it's also important to study how fragmentation of a state in Afghanistan post-communist regime in 1992, or also now on 15th August of 2021, led to an informal system of internal passport in Kabul city. Particularly in 92, it happened. As it was divided, back then Kabul was divided between different war parties. Discarding national identity card back then, Mujahideen issued their own party membership cards, and that functioned as an internal passport in Kabul, while people were moving from one locality to the other. It's interesting to understand how national identity cards, which has been issued by the state, loses its functionality at the time of internal war or state fragmentation. The state fails to implement its legitimate monopoly of movement at the time that the state is fragmented. Now, finally, I will conclude by this, that the politics of citizenship could be studied at least from 3 aspects in case of Afghanistan. Number one is politics of recognition and shift in conception of ethnic, cultural, or religious identities. Second, politics of gender insensitive citizenship, namely how women were denied citizenship at the early stage, or later, for example, they were denied recognition of motherhood, or how the laws and ID cards prevented women from bestowing citizenship to their children independent of men, and how, for example, bear offspring of national woman and a foreign man from holding their higher ranking official positions. Now, and finally, the third dimension could be the state fragmentation and issue of national passes in the 90s. As I discussed, that's also an interesting dimension to see how during the times of state failure or state fragmentations, dynamic changes and freedom of movements of people could be restricted, and then alternative documents which usually function as an internal passport within a, for example, particular entity may become much more functional compared to the national identity cards and citizenship. I will stop here, and if questions, I will come back again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think there will be lots of questions for you, some that may come through the chat box, some that our colleagues may want to pose to you. Of course, Rudab will be leading the discussions anyway, so thank you so much. Now, may I invite Qazi Marzia Babakarkhail, who is a former Supreme Court judge in Afghanistan, to share with us her thoughts on violence against women under the Taliban regime. Ma'am, you have 10 minutes. Like I said, when you have 2 minutes left, I'll have wave this sign, and at 10 minutes, I'll wave this sign. So I hope that's all right, and apologies in advance. Over to you.
Okay. Okay, Assalamualaikum. Hi, everyone. As a former judge in Afghanistan and as a women activist, I feel so sorry about my country, about my people, about the young generation, about everything we lost in the middle of night. My life experience as a former judge in Afghanistan, at the time I became a judge, there was 26 judges in Afghanistan, female judges. Became a judge in Afghanistan. It's a very hard work, and you can be very, you can face with a lot of challenges, assumptions, problems in the society as well. When I became a judge, I realized injustice around the court against women. There are always women in danger because the female judges had no rights to talk, and this was the happening. And I became an activist, and I saw not just injustice. Sometimes the law is oppressive to women. And I decided to become an activist. And I built a shelter for divorced women in 1994. And I launched a women organization called AWASCO, Afghan Women Social and Cultural Organization. The reason I did everything to stand for women in Afghanistan, to empower them. Because without education, without power, nobody can stand for their rights. When I became nothing, when I arrived in the UK, I understood how life tough for the people, for the women in Afghanistan, in the villages, and they live far from cities, and they don't have any access or ability for a modern life. The Taliban, when became in power in Afghanistan, why I want to share my story, because I'm campaigning for the female judges in Afghanistan. From 17th of August, I start campaigning for the women activists and for the fellow women judges in Afghanistan and for the all people that stand against the Taliban to get them out from Afghanistan in the safe place. When the Taliban became in power in Afghanistan, they came in my house. I was in Palakhumbri, the city I was born. They broke our door. 9 men with gun, they looking for just for a one female judge, is me. They no needed 9 men came to my house to find me and kill me. So that's the reason I stand for the female judges in Afghanistan. I know how tough it is to being a judge and be in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And the second time, when I left Afghanistan, the same night, again in Pakistan, when I established a school for Afghan refugees, because I believe just with the education we can improve our country, we can achieve more. If the Taliban, if anybody else, they broke our country thousands of times, we can build again Afghanistan, because I believe in young generation, I believe to Samira, I believe to other young generation, they are educated people, they know what they do for Afghanistan. And I believe that will be happen. We rebuild again, we can achieve again. When I was in Pakistan, I established a school for boys and for girls. Again, the Taliban, they tried to warn me, and finally they hit me by car, and I left my country the age of 44. The age of 44, I left my country. I came in the UK with no English. I cannot speak a word of English because I finished my degree in Arabic. I start a life from zero, just me, my walls, and my life. I know how tough it is for the young generation, for the judges, for the women activists. They leave Afghanistan. They don't know what future they will have. They should survive. This is not easy. You leave your country, you leave your job, you leave your status, and you became nothing. It's not easy. It's not easy. You take your children and you don't know where you go. Which country will open the door for you? I'm so feel sorry about my country, about my people. I am not weak because I know this is my anger. The all sacrifice Afghan people made, the all achievement we made, but we lost suddenly everything. Of course, the Taliban is a criminal people. When the judges, the Afghan female judges, they work in the different court, like the family court, criminal court, they put the Taliban in jail, in prisons. When the Taliban became in power, they opened the door for all the prisoners to open, and the all criminal coming out. I don't know what kind of law is this. What kind of version of Islam is this? You support the criminal, you make the society more worse. I really don't know what kind of Islam they want to bring in my country. Now the women judges in Afghanistan, they are not safe because they have enemy, criminals, Taliban system. They frozen all the judges' account, not the judges, all the women activists, all the people who work with the government. Now I think now we all Afghan people in the present, and the Taliban have a power, however they want, we should follow. But no, we became more united. We have our voice. We stand for freedom. We stand for democracy, and we believe we achieve again. And thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we're very obviously grateful that you shared your thoughts, your perspectives, opened up to us in terms of your the anger that you have over what's going on in the country, and the way in which Afghanistan has been let down by so many people, institutions, actors across the world. And I think it's a timely reminder that we can never take political institutions for granted, and we can never take freedoms for granted. It's also a timely reminder that freedom is not it has not originated in one part of the world that is then exported to the other parts of the world, but there are ideas of citizenship, there are ideas of freedom that are central to imaginations of people in every part of the world. These are universal values, as you put it, not values that emerge from one part of the world and then were forced down everywhere else. So we're very grateful, ma'am, for your for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks.
Finally, Professor Jennifer Fluri, feminist political geographer at the University of Colorado-Boulder, will share with us her insights on the geopolitics of women's roles in Afghan society. Again, you have 10 minutes. When you have 2 minutes left, I wave this sign. When you have no minutes left, I wave this sign. I hope that's all right. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation, Dr. Roy and Dr. Halder. Thank you for organizing this. I truly appreciate it. And also thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm honored and humbled to be included on this panel of such esteemed guests. So I really appreciate being asked to participate. And Marzia, thank you so much for your passion, and everything you said was just really spoke to me, because the thing that's I feel most frustrating with all the discourse, at least in the US and international media about Afghanistan now, which a lot of it is talking about women and focused on women, which I think is really important, but what often gets missed, and this is also including my own interviews, that they never include this part of it, but it's just like not only the voices of actual Afghan women that aren't being included in this discussion as enough, and the diversity of women's experiences, which I'm so glad this panel has addressed, not various kinds of diversity, not just ethnic diversity, which is very, very important, because I think what often gets missed with all the focus on women is women come from a bunch of different ethnic groups, right? They have massively different experiences depending on where they live in Afghanistan, where the type of education they've had, the type of religious group or minority group that they're part of, and even if they're part of the majority Pashtun, incredibly diverse group, right? And Omar, I so appreciate your research. It's really helped me think through Afghanistan in new ways. So thank you so much. But it's incredibly true that these categories are often false categories, first of all, and then people get sort of put into these boxes. So and then people who don't know much about Afghanistan just make a lot of assumptions about the country. And so that's basically what I want to talk about. I've been researching Afghanistan. Most of my research has been criticizing and doing critical analysis of the US military aid and economic development interventions. And more recently, we've looked at that in relationship to women's leadership in Afghanistan and their ability to have influence. And so what is going to happen with women's citizenship, I think, is a really important question. And it has to be included with all the intersections of, ethnic differences, minority status, religious beliefs, education level, and again, the geography of Afghanistan. I'm a geographer by training, so I really think that the lack of kind of understanding the geographic differences in Afghanistan is really problematic. Not so much from an academic perspective, but from how other countries have engaged with Afghanistan, and certainly the US's imperial footprint, if you will, on Afghanistan. And the other frustrating thing is the US has been intervening in Afghanistan for more than 20 years. Yes, this is the recent iteration, but they abandoned Afghanistan in the 1990s, right? And part of why Afghanistan had a civil war and all the issues that went on with the Mujahideen and the Taliban the US is partly to blame for that, of course, right? They funded and fueled the Mujahideen. They also were working very closely with the ISI in Pakistan and they legitimized the Taliban in the early days of their taking over Afghanistan in the 1990s. And then the Taliban Trump administration re-legitimizes the Taliban just recently. So these kind of things I think are really important to add to this more recent history so that we don't forget and we don't just be like, oh, well, the Afghanistan government fell because they weren't strong enough, or the military just, abandoned the posts, which I think is a really false narrative that's being portrayed very vigorously, particularly in the US, that I think it really needs to be challenged. And also the idea of women's roles and women's rights in Afghanistan, I think, has to be an important part of this discussion, because when the Taliban said that they would allow women to operate as long as it was under Islam, I totally agree with Marzia. What Islam are you talking about? It's not like Afghanistan stopped being a Muslim country over the last 20 years. They're already operating under the umbrella of Islam. It's a Muslim country. Women activists doesn't mean because they're women activists, they're not Muslims. And many women, have incorporated women's rights in Islam and come from Islamic feminist perspective in order to articulate their rights within the country. And I think that is not understood enough. And so much of the aid and development money that went into Afghanistan for women's programming really, I think many of the missteps based on our research and the research of others was the lack of listening to Afghan women with all the complications, contradictions, and diversity of thought and experience. And I think that diversity is a value and something that should be honored rather than something that should be critiqued, because it often is critiqued. In fact, many of the women's rights activists we've interviewed over the years have said it's so frustrating because we're always told, oh, you women can't get it together. And they're like, where are the men and their unity, right? Why are women held to a higher standard but giving fewer resources and opportunities to actually work on women's rights issues? Because it has to be diverse. What works in one part of the country does not necessarily work in another. What is going to work for a woman in a particular household may work in a different way in another household. So that level of diversity, I think, really needs to be highlighted more and understood in order to actually assist Afghan women who are doing the work on the ground. And we don't hear enough from them as well. I mean, I cannot speak for Afghan women, and I don't think any one person could speak for the entirety of Afghan women in the country. I'm just speaking based on the research that we've done. And then what's happening with citizenship now with the Taliban, I mean, we have to remember a lot of women and men, but women in government, women in the civil society organizations and the non-governmental organizations, you know, have quite literally lost their jobs, right? They've lost their ability and their to influence because so much of the funding has stopped, and there is this abandonment of Afghanistan by the international community that I think is just horrific. When they should be held to account for their failures and mistakes over the past 20 years, and then of course the US even 20 years before that. So this is like the situation in Afghanistan now geopolitically is, you know, we could see the writing. Those of us who study Afghanistan, you know, we warn the government about this. We try to express our critiques, and even government employees like the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction in the US, John Sopko, who works for the State Department, wrote many and many reports that were largely ignored about the missteps that were done and not listening to the people of Afghanistan. And doing projects that really generated wealth for a select few on the backs of the impoverished many, if you will. So these sort of missteps are part of why we are geopolitically here with the Taliban back in power. Thank you. Also, I'll just close with going back to my critiques of the U.S. is that the U.S. I would argue that the U.S. was always in Afghanistan based on their own geostrategic needs and their geopolitical interests in the region, and not for the Afghan people, and not for the many needs that Afghanistan has economically, socially, politically, because they were there for their own needs and their own interests, and there was not an earnest, at the geopolitical level. I do think at an individual scale, there were many people that were there to try to help, and were really stymied by the way in which funds were allocated and the way in which information was shared in a very limited capacity. And so I just want to close by saying that I am again very honored to be here. I do think that the Afghan people and a lot of the women's rights activists and that are now in desperate need to leave the country because their lives are quite literally under threat. And they face what Marzia said, this impossible decision to stay and face potentially being killed, or having their horrible things happening to their family, or leaving the country, the only country they've known in many cases, to a very uncertain future. And waiting in a third country for over a year till they can get processed for an asylum case or a refugee case in the US, and then having to live as a refugee in a country that is not necessarily welcoming to refugees. So this is the situation many women's rights activists who must leave the country or who have already left the country are facing. And we need to really focus on them as much as the many, many women and men who are going to be left behind in Afghanistan and have to face an uncertain future with the Taliban. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Fluri. It's, again, you know, very, very useful and insightful observations, which, you know, will get us to think about what next and how we got to where we did, and what one might do about it. Now I would like to invite Rudab for her thoughts, comments, and questions. Dr. Rudab Shaheed wears many hats. She is, of course, a postdoctoral fellow at New College, Florida. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council, and a senior consultant at the European Institute of International Law and International Relations. Before joining Florida, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of York, my colleague, at the Rethinking Civil Society project at the university. And a part of that project was funded by the Leverhulme Center. Dr. Shaheed specializes on the situation of the stateless Rohingya Muslim population in the Rakhine state of Myanmar and looks at possible comparisons with the ongoing process of disenfranchisement to Bangla-speaking Muslims in India's northeast Assam state. So questions of citizenship, questions of relations to the state are central to her work. And we thought there would be useful conversations across South Asia that she could lead. So over to you, Rudab.
Thank you, Indrajit, for having me as the discussant, and thank you to Indrajit, Buddha, and Filippo, and of course all our panelists who could join us in such quick time for this very important and timely session. So I would like to ask a very general question, building on Jen's presentation, actually. So, the US has been intervening in Afghanistan for decades. One question that comes up off and on is that there was a lot of corruption. Of course, Afghanistan was a young country that was supposed to be for many developing countries. And there has been this perception going around that the elite was very corrupt and there was a top-down approach with a very strong center. And that was facilitated by US foreign policy. How much do you think is that responsible for the return of the Taliban, in your opinion? Because it appears that, in the rural and the sparsely populated areas, people were not really benefiting from the 2 decades of democracy, if I may call it. The second question that I have is actually related to the history of the country. I mean, Omar, your work on ethnicity, of course, and history of the country. I mean, if we ever have, another, and I hope another democracy in Afghanistan, how would we frame history for the general population? Because as we know, it's a very ethnically diverse country. And of course, building on that, I mean, we have been talking about the role of Afghan women. Marzia here, she had this role as Supreme Court judge, and Samira here, another activist, for the Amnesty International there. If we have, if we have to rewrite history of the country in the next few years, how would we make it, in a way that it's inclusive of all ethnic groups and, of course, women's voices? Because when I've been reading history of this country, it seems like, some voices are suppressed, some are amplified, and that's with all histories. But definitely in a case like Afghanistan, how do we make sure that it's more inclusive? So that's my broad question to everybody. Do you want to start, Omar, and then we go along with the ladies, or should we do ladies first?
Yeah, maybe ladies first, and then I will come.
Okay, so Samira, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I just have another question back to you before I respond to your question. What do you mean by elite? What's your definition of elite? Then I can respond, because elite is a very broad title that is being used in Afghanistan. So I would like to get a bit of clarity on that.
Right. So what I get from the news reports is that certain people who gained wealth over this time and were from certain influential families, and they were the people benefiting. That's the larger news report coming out. So I would classify that as elite.
Sure. Look, what has happened in Afghanistan, especially in the past 20 years, of course, it has been the international community, especially the US, who empowered these, I wouldn't necessarily call them elites, but I would call them powerful actors, powerful warlords. They control the country. They send their children abroad to study, seek education, but they discriminated people in the country. And who empowered these groups was the international community. When Bonn Conference in 2001 happened, of course, they did not want to sit with Taliban. It was clear, but there were a lot of other, militant groups in the country because of the civil war and because they were fighting with each other, that they were needed to come to the table, and they needed promises to not fight with each other once again. And that's where I think the base of corruption started from there, because the US promised them positions, the US promised them, power. The US started dividing power in Bonn Conference in 2001. And that is where I think the base of corruption started in a country like Afghanistan. When we move ahead, of course, when you're a young government, democratic government, after decades of civil war and repression of Taliban, you certainly don't have the capacities and expertise and knowledge that you need to run a country, right? And then the international community just comes and bomb you up with a huge amount of money, saying we are committed to reestablish Afghanistan and rebuild Afghanistan. And that's where, of course, corruption takes place. Of course, the powerful people take the control and they become part of, they make the system corrupt. Then comes the role of, democratic institutions. For example, the Election Commission. One of the most corrupt institutions in Afghanistan has been the Election Commission. The way they have been conducted the elections, the way they have been, not monitoring the election, but basically overseeing the election. Reports by the EU and other countries, both in a couple of elections that took place in Afghanistan, always found that there has been massive corruption in the elections. There has been massive fraud in the election, but the same international community ignored it. The same international community, came, applaud those who won, and they were cheering up the young democracy in Afghanistan. So that's where the base of the corruption has started in the country, and then when you have the money, you have power. That's what I have seen in 20 years in Afghanistan. You are United States of America, you have a lot of money, you have money, so you have power. And that's how you direct stuff. That's how you put things on record, and you dictate people. And that's what has been happening in the past 20 years. What is being discussed in the media, and also what is being discussed within international community, is the fact that Afghans are corrupt, that Afghan leaders are corrupt. But nobody talks about, international community's corruption. Nobody talks about their misuse of Afghanistan in the last 20 years. And that's where, we end up with being the first corrupt country in the world, simply because nobody talks about their corruption. Nobody talks about their role. So I have dozens of stories of corruption in women's rights focused projects and work. If you're interested, I can share with you my email address, touch base, and I can give you dozens of examples that those of us who spoke about those corruption in international community, we were blacklisted. We were identified as spoilers. We were identified as difficult people. We were identified as people that we just want money for ourselves, and we don't want other women to benefit from it. I, as an activist, that my aim has been empowerment of women. I never had an NGO. I never asked for projects, which is not a bad thing, by the way. was blacklisted simply by the USAID and Afghanistan because I was criticizing them on the programs that they had for Afghan women. So it's very deep, you know, it's very dirty when we are discussing corruption in Afghanistan. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Samira, for your thoughts on that. And, I'm sorry about your experience, of course. Marzia, if you're there, do you want to say something, or should we go to Jennifer and then Omar? Marzia, I don't think she's around, so let's go to Jen and then Omar.
Thank you so much, Samira. First of all, I'd love to stay in touch with you on email, so just saying that, but also absolutely agree. No one talks about the international corruption. It was huge, and way more money was made by internationals on this 20-year conflict than the Afghans that were corrupt. Yes, there was some Afghan corruption, but it was fractional compared to the international corruption. Absolutely. People were being paid exorbitant amounts of money, like $30,000 to $40,000 a month to work in Afghanistan as an international worker. Also, when the US first came in, they literally took bags of cash to the warlords, who then bought up property in Kabul and then rented that to the NGOs, the international NGOs. So they were paying $50,000 and $60,000 a month to rent a house in Kabul. And this is in the early intervention period, right? So throughout the early 2000s. So you have, and we don't talk enough about this or at all in the US. It's so frustrating that how many people, and then when you add in all the private security and private military, the private logistics companies, the private contractors, people, I mean, I interviewed international workers who literally made so much money, they would come back to the US and buy like a $600,000 house for cash. I mean, we're talking huge amounts of wealth production for mostly white internationals working as part of the so-called aid and development mission. And what did they do when they were in Afghanistan? They stayed in their compounds and they went to their international restaurants, and they barely spent time with Afghans, except for the Afghans in their offices. And then you also had the other internal brain drain that was happening throughout the entire 20 years, where you had Afghan NGOs and women's rights organizations and civil society organizations that would do the hard work of training people in Afghanistan how to do the kind of work necessary for this aid mission. And then those people would leave the Afghan NGOs and go work for the international NGOs and double or triple their salary, even though they were being paid a fraction of what the international workers were being paid. So you also have this huge disparity of incomes between the local NGOs who really knew what they were doing and could do the work on the ground, but had anemic budgets. And then you have these huge international organizations that are just subcontracting and throwing money around, but not necessarily actually doing the work. It's an absolute tragedy what happened. And I totally agree with you, Samira. It's absolutely infuriating that no one talks about the international corruption, because that corruption was then modeled in the Afghan government because they weren't paying people. I mean, ministers were moonlighting as taxi drivers to make ends meet in the early intervention period. So they set up the system to be corrupt. And it wasn't like there was a system that then became corrupt. Corruption was the system that was put in by the US and other international powers. And so while all the blame gets placed on Afghans, I think that is absolutely not only unfair, but incorrect. What are people supposed to do when they have to feed their families, right? So corruption became the system that was modeled after the international corruption, in my analysis and opinion, for sure. And I also think that, yes, that is why we have the Taliban today, right? Because the government was ineffective. And if you look at many Afghans, particularly outside urban areas and even in urban areas, they went back to their local systems, customary systems, like community-based dispute resolution, sort of informal systems for judiciary type cases, because of the corruption that was in the so-called formal system, right? And in many ways, there was always a pushback to what the U.S. was trying to do with these various kind of systems in the government, because of the corruption that they perpetuated. in Afghanistan. And also the part of what creates corruption is people not being able to, going back to the pay issue, the pay differentials were just embarrassingly stark. For example, like in one of the NGOs that we looked at, we basically figured out that the internationals were making basically about $200 an hour for their work, and the Afghans in that office were making $200 a month. That's a huge difference, right? I mean, like those kind of stark differences are not talked about enough. And so many people, internationals mostly, and some Afghans became wealthy people over this conflict, and that happened on the backs of, again, of poor Afghans who didn't really see much, if any, of that international aid. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Jennifer, to adding to what Samira was saying. And, you know, this idea that we don't talk much about what the international community, the corruption that was, you know, the international community had taken part of. So over to you, Marzia, your thoughts on this, and then Omar.
I agree with both of the panelists, but I'm a bit surprised. Which country there is no corruption, and why we should blame always Afghanistan? Nobody see our achievement. Nobody recognize our sacrifices, but always we are in the top to be the top of assumptions. If the international community and other different countries, they came to Afghanistan with a large salaries, or because somebody came for holiday just to have a job in Afghanistan, but Afghan people, they all work for their countries. I'm not part of the government. Maybe some of the panelists is not part of the government, but I'm not agree with this. The people in Afghanistan, they are involved with the corruption. There are a lot of different. Our enemies is more clever than us. They are clever on their way, but we are trust on the people we shouldn't trust. That's all I know.
Okay. Thank you for your thoughts on this. Omar, before you get started, can you tell us a little bit of if we ever have to write a history that is inclusive of all Afghan people, particularly different ethnicities and women, how do we do that? And of course, your thoughts on ideas of corruption that's floating around in the international community.
Okay, thank you. On how to write history and how history of Afghanistan, at least the political history of Afghanistan, was written in the last 100 years. Of course, being a post-colonial state, the history of Afghanistan was constructed by enormous amount of colonial literature, number one. And secondly, since 1920s, there was a state-run institution called Historical Association of Afghanistan, or Historical Society of Afghanistan, which was funded and mandated by the state to write down a history of modern state called Afghanistan. So that's why it first of all tried to eradicate sociocultural diversity in Afghanistan and reduce everything to one single state-sponsored identity, which is Afghan. And the pre-Islamic and medieval history of Afghanistan, which was not called at that time, the region was not called Afghanistan, was somehow erased in the state. An Afghan version of history was established. And that's somehow the same. It's a kind of politicized history. Now, a couple of other scholars and international historians has tried to present alternative history. For example, Jonathan Lee, who's a British historian, he has written a book, most recently, I think 2018, and Thomas Barfield from United States, who's an anthropologist, he has presented a different version of history of Afghanistan. From local historians, I think we have a well-known one, which is Omar, but his history is covering till 1960s, not much forward, because he was one of the constitutionalists and intellectuals during 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So writing a different history of Afghanistan, first of all, requires deconstruction of the contemporary state-centered, politicized history of Afghanistan. And then I think oral history and writing history from bottom-up perspective would be much more required. So that's why scholars like Thomas Barfield, who came up from an anthropological background, they had been able to present something different. Or Jonathan Lee, who collected oral history, he was able to present something quite different. And also we should have a critical lens to all the sources, which has somehow sponsored the current modern history of Afghanistan, which included colonial literature. That's number one. Second, on corruption, I think most recently Hamida Bashi has written an article on reflecting on diversity of new version of Taliban, as well as how the US intervention failed in Afghanistan. And he claimed that one of the key byproducts of the US intervention in the last couple of years was emergence of a comprador class of political elite, totally alienated from its own people, beholden to the false promise of the US military and political hegemony. And you can see exactly what Hamid Dabashi says when you observe and analyze some of the key top political leaders, including Ashraf Ghani, Ahmed Karzai, others like Abdullah and Qanuni, for example. Each of them disconnected from the people. You ask them to what extent, for example, they have traveled to the districts, to the villages, they have spoken to the people, they sit down with them, listen to them, nothing. They are completely disconnected. But instead, their speeches, their policies, their rhetoric is directly oriented towards how to attract international funds, how to please and charm, for example, US politicians or Western politicians. So of course, I think political economy of aid, which was explained, I think, by Dr. Jennifer and others, I second that one. And also the political economy of war all reinforce these dynamics, that why politicians turn corrupt, incompetent, without their roots on the ground with the people, and instead trying to charm the Westerns, right? So this is all this byproduct of this complex colonial intervention of the United States. Third, on how we can, for example, later on reflect on history of democracy in the last 20 years. I think that also, let me quote another author who just on 7th of October, Fenton O'Toole, who he wrote a paper on in one of the well-known websites. The title is The Lie of Nation Building. And he says that now the great question of Americans' 20 years war in Afghanistan was not whether Afghanistan were fit for democracy, it was whether democratic values were strong enough in the US to be projected into a traumatized society 7,000 miles away. So now, yeah, of course, some of the dominant narratives around failure in Afghanistan is to say, oh, well, these people were tribal, these people were barbaric, they were, as Biden was saying, for 1,000 years they failed to build a nation, so that's why we can do it. But at the same time, it's also the question that to what extent the incompetent, probably democratic system in the US was also unable to even to export something outside. And of course, from the literature of political science, we know that a foreign intervention never succeeds in establishing a democratic order in some other places. So that's why I think people of Afghanistan, they are having research about what democracy is and how it should function. They know how to hold their state accountable. Of course, they were not able in the last couple of years because of the different layers of complex dynamics, US presence, international forces, and also the political elite who were reinforced, their power was reinforced not by the national system, but also by dynamics from the above. but still, yeah, Afghanistan's democracy didn't emerge in 2001. There were episodes, of course, ups and downs, episodes of democracy in 1949 and 1963. We had a democratic constitution, elections. So this is not coming, I'm not reflecting all of this from a nationalist standpoint, but to say that to just begin democratic history of Afghanistan from 2001 is factually and historically not correct. And there were episodes of democratic institutions earlier. But now the fact is that I will stop with this. What form of democracy shall we have in Afghanistan in order to lead us toward a stable system? Two of the main misunderstandings that the US had, and that led to failure. Number one was to build a democracy based on a very hierarchical, centralized state in Kabul. And Afghanistan historically was kind of de facto federal society. You have different regions in Afghanistan which has their own internal dynamics. And these were because of geography, but because of cultural dynamics. They had not been oriented towards Kabul, rather the dynamics of Kabul was defined and determined by dynamics at the local level. So that's why a centralized state has been one of the key failures of the state on 15 August. Why? Simply because Ashraf Ghani fled the country, all the institutions abruptly and suddenly and quickly fall apart just in a couple of hours because one guy on the top disappeared. So apart from that, there are so many other things that how this centralized system ruined the political order in Afghanistan. That's number one. Second, US somehow also tried to reinvent the old hierarchy, social hierarchy which existed in the history. And that also came from their ignorance of Afghanistan's diversity and sociocultural dynamics. And that is with relation to cultural diversity and how, for example, the intersection between sociocultural dynamics and diversity on one hand and the political system should be put together. And of course, how to correctly put this, somehow to think that we aim to construct a citizenship which should be insensitive to cultural diversity was one of the key failures. So I think a different notion of citizenship which should be, I think, culturally very sensitive and recognize differences is much more important, wherein you will have different layers of loyalty and connection relationship with the state, not just direct one from the top state in Kabul to the bottom level in communities. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Omar, for your thoughts on history and, of course, how we can imagine how proper citizenship structure could develop in such a diverse society as Afghanistan. Well, we have a question here for Samira, if she's here. I see her videos off, but I'll just read it out. So how many Hindus and Sikh households are left in Afghanistan approximately, if you can say that? And also, Samira, if you can also add, I used to work for the Baha'i International Community's UN office at one point in my career. And there is a sizable Baha'i population, as far as I know, in Afghanistan. Can you tell us about their experience with religious freedom in the last 20 years?
On the question on the number, the latest information that is available is around 220 families of Sikh and Hindu religious minority were in Afghanistan before all this mess that happened. Right now, I have no numbers. because we don't really know how many of them have succeeded to leave the country and how many of them are still in the country. However, of course, there was an opportunity for some of them, for them and their families to move to India just in the beginning when evacuations were happening. But I unfortunately don't have an exact figure about it. On your question about Baha'i community in Afghanistan, unfortunately, I don't have information. I have not been able to look into it, but I won't be really able to comment at this point.
Samira, can I just have a follow-up question regarding the Hindus and Sikhs of Afghanistan? As you know, the Indian Parliament in 2019 passed the CAA. Can you tell us how many people from Afghanistan are actually benefiting from that citizenship amendment law?
How many people benefited or benefiting is like, you know, whatever the laws and regulations and policies existed in Afghanistan, we can't really, we can't really talk about it today. But the challenge in Afghanistan in the last 20 years have been having a lot of policies, laws and regulations, but limited implementations, weak implementations. So this has been the same for your question, that we don't really have exact kind of information available. What usually the government does, usually the past government used to do is that, okay, fine, we introduce certain laws and degrees, and then we would go with action planning, development, and all sorts of other bureaucracies that were required. And then, of course, in Afghanistan, Parliament was another big challenge when it comes to a lot of right-based work, because they would simply not approve. They would simply hold legislations and not policies, but legislations and laws. I think what has happened in Afghanistan in terms of the specific law that you're referring, it started shaping up, and there were work around it, but unfortunately, reports on its implementation and in terms of how many people benefited actually from them and all those things is not available as far as I know.
Thank you, Samira. So the next question is for Jen. Jennifer, if you can unmute yourself. We have been talking about the corruption from the international community. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? So was it more that the US was involved in it, or other countries, or the larger international bodies? Can you elaborate a little bit from your research, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So yeah, a lot of it was from the US. I mean, they're the largest donor country, but there were over 50 countries operating on Afghanistan at any given time in various, whether it was military as part of the coalition of the willing, and then the International Security Assistance Force, and then of course in aid and development. And I would say the larger organizations, you saw more corruption in those, and some of them included, the UN, I'm not a super fan of UNAMA and their work in Afghanistan, because they're the worst at like staying in their compounds and not engaging with the community and not listening. And UN Women, many of I have interviewed several people who were in charge of UN Women over the years, and their kind of dismissiveness of Afghan women's ideas I found to be just both surprising and insulting to those Afghan women. And so I would say it wasn't just the US, but as the largest donor organization and kind of the leader in some ways, there was also a huge lack of organization and cooperation among the different aid organizations, particularly the ones that were vying for the big money, right? So it's not like it was this coordinated effort. It was actually very uncoordinated. So that was another huge problem. And for example, the UN, they abandoned the UN compound in Kabul, and one of friends I've worked with for many years is he himself is stuck in the compound. He was a driver for the UN. They left all the Afghan staff behind and about 300 to 400 Nepalis because they just assumed they were Afghans, I guess. And so they evacuated their international staff except for the Nepalis and really abandoned the Afghan staff there. So, so this is, I mean, I think a lot of it, and most of my critique is leveled at the US, but they weren't the only one. A lot of these huge, well-funded organizations were also part of the kind of corruption problem. And then you have what I call the Beltway bandits, which is the Beltway is this highway around DC, and you have all of these various organizations, and a lot of them are private, profit-driven organizations that vie for USAID and other US like Department of State contracts. They're known as implementing partners. And that, talk about corruption, I mean, they were literally there for the money. And sometimes a little bit of that money would flow to the Afghan NGOs. But again, by the time you have these multiple levels of subcontracting, by the time it actually got to the NGOs that knew what to do and could work on the ground, precious little funds were left. And you can also see that in the construction where you had buildings built without rebar or diluted cement. And so you had some buildings collapse, a lot of roads degraded much quicker than they should have because the funds weren't there for the materials and for the laborers. And then that all gets blamed on Afghans. And that's a tragedy in my opinion, and as well as like, this is well-documented research. I've written a book on this. If anyone wants to see that research, I'm happy to share it. So that kind of corruption isn't understood or even part of the discussion. And like the debates in the US right now aren't, and I think a lot of criticism should be put on the Biden administration, but we're not here because of the Biden administration. Like the evacuation mishandling, totally that administration's fault. But this goes back to the Bush administration and the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Like, no, it can't, nor should it all fall on Biden for sure. But I definitely think, he does deserve, his administration deserves a lot of critique because they've abandoned. I mean, I have over 150 colleagues, it's like 29 colleagues and then their families. So it's 150 people that have just been abandoned. They're stuck in Afghanistan and they're not helping them get out. And they're like, oh, you don't need passports or paperwork to get refugee status, but we won't process your paperwork until you're in a third country. So how do you get to that third country without paperwork, right? And some people burn their paperwork or destroy it because they were so afraid the Taliban would see that they were connected to internationals that they can't even put together the paperwork necessary to get out of the country. So these, I'm just saying, like, these failures continue to this day. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure if I got everything there.
We had a holistic answer. So thanks, Jen, on your thoughts based on your research, of course. Marzia, before I ask this question, apologies, but there's this whole debate about this maybe a changed Taliban. Under this Taliban administration, how do you see the role of women in judiciary? Because they've already said that women will not take part in policy making, if I'm wrong. So how would they be accommodated into judiciary, such as, as judges or lawyers? Marzia, can you unmute yourself, please?
The Taliban announced they not accept female judges again in the court, in the Supreme Court, however, because they're thinking being a woman and to be a judge is against Islam. There is no place anymore for female judges or for female to become a judge in Afghanistan. It's very clear message from the Taliban.
Okay, thank you for sharing that information. Omar, your research relates to various ethnicities in the country. Well, I was wondering that during these past few years, when we had the peace process going on in Afghanistan, was there ever a time that was more positive? Because even with the Doha Accords that was signed last year, it didn't seem very inclusive. And I mean, could you share your thoughts on that?
All right, so let me come to the previous question about number of Hindus and Sikhs that you asked, I think, Samira. I had a conversation with Anarkali Hunariyar, who was one of the Sikh representatives in the parliament, and based on the latest data that she provided, only 120 Hindus and Sikhs are left in Afghanistan. Not families, 120 people. And that's shocking because there are also plans going on to evacuate them. And on the other hand, on 10th September, the report came that the only last remaining Jew of Afghanistan, who was named Zablon Somenov, he also got out of Afghanistan. So Taliban, which is a blend of radical Deobandi Islam plus Afghan nationalism, Afghan ethno-nationalism, has been disastrous for minority rights and cultural diversity in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is losing its historical heritage. Our historical heritage is destroyed, but as well as the historical identity we had in terms of our diversity. That's number one. Second, on the peace process that started since 2019. First of all, the US designed the process in a manner which excluded government of Afghanistan, and hence that automatically delegitimized the state and reduced the state into a faction amongst various other factions, including the Taliban. That was number one. Secondly, of course, policies of United States was designed by the State Department and many other institutions, particularly the Office of the President, but at the same time, the person of Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who is an Afghan origin American, had also ruined the process to a large extent because it was him trying to manipulate perspectives, public opinion, and news policymakers on the nature of Taliban. He was the one who spoke about a changed, moderate Taliban, while they were not moderate, while they changed, but changed towards much more radical ideology. Of course, yeah, Taliban today, they are much more internet savvy. They don't have problem with cameras, probably with technology, with cell phones. Of course, they understand to what extent they can use all of these technologies for their own benefit. But in terms of their religious thinking, they're much more radical. In terms of their ethno-nationalism, they are much more radical today. So that's why the Taliban of today are much more dangerous compared to the Taliban of 90s, and much more brutal in terms of their techniques of suppression and repression compared to the earlier. Now on inclusion, unfortunately, because politics, national politics of Afghanistan, at one level, it was shaped by certain form of patronage. That's why those who were representing Afghanistan and the negotiating team in Qatar, they were there just because of their certain political linkages that they had. And until end of the day, President Ashraf Ghani tried to exclusively control who should be there and who should not be there. So inclusion and exclusion into the peace process and the peace negotiating team of Afghanistan was in the hand of Ashraf Ghani, the president. And he constantly rejected any form of national dialogue, which should lead to a certain form of national consensus, and also certain form of very broad-based inclusion. So when we talk about inclusion, of course, this inclusion means gender inclusion, inclusion of women, meaningful of inclusion of them. This inclusion, of course, means in terms of, the median age of Afghanistan is below, around 19 years old. So that means that majority of the people who are now under Taliban rule, they were born after 2000, and they were just the duration of last 2 decades. So to what extent substantially they were represented in the peace talks, right? The younger generation, the youth. And thirdly, inclusion of ethno-cultural group or nationalities. I do not know, of course, unfortunately in Afghanistan, because of the politics of patronage, these has become the talk about inclusion has had a different meaning, which meant inclusion of those who are in the top position, the political elite. So they had a certain form of monopoly over representation of their communities that reinforced the politics of patronage. So now it was quite difficult to establish a form of meaningful representation, which should be, of course, based on a form of national deliberation, national dialogue, wherein what agenda should be discussed or presented in the peace talks should have not just come directly from the person of the president or the minds of only those who had access to the negotiating team, but through a wider kind of conversation at the national or local level. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. So that's why, at the end of the day, those who represented Afghanistan there, they were incompetent. They didn't have even basic skills of negotiations. They didn't have knowledge about history of the war in Afghanistan, history of the conflict, causes of the conflict, and how to negotiate peace in Afghanistan. It ended in the failure.
Okay, thank you, all the panelists, and for sharing your thoughts. And this was a very timely discussion. And thank you to Indrajit and Buddha and Filippo for putting this together. And thank you for making me the discussant, so I could get most of my questions solved after 1 month of what has happened in August. So over to you now, Indrajit. I believe you have the closing remarks. And
that's Buddha. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
That's Buddha.
All right.
Okay. Thank you all panelists. We requested 2 days back, and you are kind enough to join the panel. We're really grateful, and we hope to continue this type of discussion in future as well under our the consortium, and then we are planning to organize several seminars. It won't be day-long seminar, but we hopefully we'll organize 2 hours to 4 hours seminar in future. So we will be in touch with you, and thank you once again. Thank you for your time and contribution. Thank you very much. So we will have now the final session, and I think on panel members, they are in